On the 15th of July, 1986, 38-year-old Nancy Daugherty was a Chisholm, Minnesota resident who worked as an aide in a local nursing home. She also worked as a part-time bartender and enjoyed volunteering as a part-time emergencies medical technician. She was married and had 2 children. Her husband was working overseas for the National Guard, and she planned to move to the Twin Cities to further her studies. That night, she went out drinking with her unidentified boyfriend and later dropped her off at her house. That was the last time he saw her again. The following morning, her boyfriend rang the police to ask them to conduct a welfare check on Nancy, as he couldn't reach her. Neighbours reportedly heard a woman screaming from her home as well. The police arrived that afternoon and discovered her body laying there. She had been suffocated and assaulted. They noted that there were struggles both inside and outside of the house. Forensic investigators recovered DNA samples from the scene, but it didn't match anyone in the FBI DNA database. Recently this year, a DNA sample was sent to Parabon, a company that specialises in genealogy, to help generate leads in criminal cases. They notified law enforcement agents that 52-year-old Michael Allen Carbo Jr. was found to be associated with the genetic lineage of the unknown suspect. Investigators kept a close eye on Carbo. Then on the 23rd of July, 2020, authorities saw Carbo throw away some garbage. They then collected it and found items that could be tested. Carbo's rubbish was a match to the bodily fluids found on Daugherty's body and at the scene. Then, on the 29th of July the following week, they collected a sample from Carbo himself, and it was also matched. At the time Daugherty's body was discovered, Carbo was living less than a mile from her and attended school with her children. Carbo was 18 years old at the time. That same day he was arrested and then charged for taking Daugherty's life 34 years later. His bail had been set at $1 million and is due back in court on the 6th of August 2020. If he is found guilty, he could face up to 40 years in jail. Melissa Lee was a 15-year-old girl and Bothell, Washington resident. She was home alone, as a friend was supposed to stay the night, never made it there. On the 13th of April 1993, Melissa spoke to her mother Sharon from the home phone at about 9:30 p.m. that night, but when her mother returned after midnight, Melissa was nowhere to be found. There were signs of struggles inside. The front door was ajar, the living room table was askew, an ashtray had fallen to the floor, and a glass of milk was spilt. Her mother reported her daughter missing that night, and when daylight broke, a search party went out looking for her. Her body was discovered at 3 p.m. on the 14th of April 1993 in a ravine under a bridge at Edgewater Creek in Everett, Washington. It was determined that she was abducted from her home, suffocated, then thrown off the bridge. A 35-year-old man named Alan Edward Dean was interviewed 3 times by authorities in 1993, as his contact information was in her address book under the name Michael. Dean was doing day shift work at Boeing and lived in Everett, Washington back then. He admitted to police they had chatted through a night talk line and dated twice in March that year, and used the name Mike during those conversations. Dean was successfully identified with the assistance from Parabon, a DNA technology company that performed genetic genealogy analysis for the case. A digital file containing DNA genotype derived from evidence at the time was uploaded to a public genetic genealogy website, and promising matches were found for multiple of the suspect's relatives. After Parabon identified Dean, detectives subsequently acquired an abandoned DNA sample from a discarded cigarette butt he had used. Washington's crime lab then positively matched the DNA profile from the evidence at the scene. It was believed that he also purchased ethyl ether and heptane chemicals, which were found in the body as noted in the toxicology report, which may cause dizziness and disorientation. Dean only lived 3.6 miles at the time from where Lee's body was found. Dean, now 62 years old, was arrested without incident at 5 p.m. on the 28th of July 2020 near his residence in Bothell, and is expected to be charged with abducting and taking Lee's life. Melissa's mother said after learning of the news, "I'm just happy I got to live long enough to see this happen. I hope he rots in hell." On the 20th of September 1982, 8-year-old Ohio resident Kellyanne Prosser said goodbye to her teacher and classmates. She started walking home from the Columbus Indianola Elementary School, which was approximately a 15-block walk. She was last seen crossing a busy intersection, but that night she never made it home. When Kelly didn't arrive immediately home from school, her mum thought maybe Kelly had stopped by a friend's house or was staying after school for an activity. Her mum phoned the school and several of Kelly's friends' parents, but no one had seen her. When 6 p.m. came and Kelly still hadn't arrived home, her mum called the police and reported her missing. A search party went out looking for Kelly. The police used sniffer dogs to try to track her scent. It was tracked to the intersection where she was last seen, then it stopped. Police assumed that she had gotten into a vehicle at this point. 2 days after Kelly's disappearance, a man by the name of Charles Richmond was driving along a road in Madison County to pick up his housekeeper. Along the way, he noticed a small bit of blue plastic on the road. He didn't stop, but continued on his way. After picking her up, Charles once again came across a piece of blue plastic in the road and pointed it out to her. They decided to stop and see what it was. It was a child's raincoat. Having no idea of the abduction that took place in nearby Franklin County, the housekeeper searched the coat to look for a name. She found no name, but she did find a single metal bolt in the pocket. She set the raincoat on the floor of the car, and they forgot about it. That evening, Charles picked up his 21-year-old daughter from work. When she got in his car, she questioned him about the raincoat on the floor. After hearing his explanation, she immediately told him that she'd heard about Kelly's disappearance, and the coat he had found may have been hers. Charles contacted the police and took them to the location, which was south of Plain City, where the coat was found. A few hours later, an officer combing a nearby cornfield, just 1 mile from where the coat was located, they discovered Kelly's body. She had been assaulted and suffocated. There were no footprints in the mud, so the police concluded that Kelly was most likely thrown from a vehicle. For more than 3 decades, Kelly's case remained unsolved, but Columbus investigators continued to search for answers for her family. In late winter 2019 and early spring 2020, detectives began working with Advanced DNA, a genealogy company, to try and use DNA from the scene in 1982 to find a match. They had a DNA profile, but didn't have a name to go with it. A family tree was constructed by members of the cold case unit. They then followed up on leads with possible family members, including distant relatives. In March 2020, Columbus police narrowed it down and a DNA match was made. It was confirmed to be Harold Warren Jarrell, who was responsible for taking Kelly's life. He wasn't even on their radar. His DNA profile had been encoded since it started, but there's no forensic evidence tying him to any case since. If there was, it wouldn't have generated a hit. Jarrell had been convicted in 1977 as a child predator and had served 5 years in prison. Unfortunately, Kelly's family won't see any justice in this case, as he passed away in Las Vegas in 1996 at the age of 67. He would have been 53 at the time of Kelly's abduction. On the 21st of October 1980, Michael Lee was a 29-year-old iron worker from Indiana. He was visiting Arizona at the time. On that day, his body was discovered off Highway 179 near Milestone 300 in an unincorporated area of Yavapai County. He'd been shot in the head a few times. At the time, no suspects were identified. However, cigarette butts from the scene were kept by the forensic investigators. In June of 2018, a volunteer with the Sheriff's Cold Case Unit sent the cigarette butts to a lab for DNA analysis. Results indicated that 2 of the cigarette butts had the DNA of David Ellsworth Widmer, who was 31 at the time of the incident. Following the new suspect DNA evidence provided, Detective John McDormand was assigned the lead investigator in October of 2018. In July 2020, DNA evidence brought an end to a 4-decade-old cold case. It was identified that Rocky Crabtree and David Widmer were accomplices. It was established that Lee knew both of them. The motive appeared to be to rob him. The suspects were told Lee had a large amount of cash on him and that he kept the money in a bandana on his leg. The bandana was removed and Widmer's DNA was found on it. The suspects, however, believing the money was in the bandana, failed to check the wallet and fled the scene. They left with only small amounts of low-grade substances instead. Lee's wallet was in a pocket of his pants, and there was over $1,000 in cash. Crabtree passed away in 1990, and Widmer in 2019.